The bitter January wind swept through the streets of Nashville, carrying with it the faint echoes of country music that spilled from the honky-tonks and bars. For most tourists and locals, this musical backdrop was the soundtrack to their evening, entertainment. For 9-year-old Miguel Oliveira, however, it was merely the sound that accompanied his desperate hunger pangs as he huddled against a brick wall in an alley behind the famous Broadway Strip. Miguel pulled his thin jacket tighter around his small frame, his fingers numb from the cold. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and the threadbare gloves his mother had found at a donation center weeks ago did little to protect him from the biting chill. His stomach growled painfully, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning when a kind bakery worker had secretly slipped him a day-old muffin. "Man will be back soon," he whispered to himself in Portuguese. Trying to keep his spirits up, she promised, "Just a few more hours." If you're touched by Miguel's struggle, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will warm your heart and restore your faith in humanity. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful moments of compassion and hope. 3 months ago, Miguel and his mother Rosanna had been living in a small but cozy 1-bedroom apartment in the outskirts of Nashville. It wasn't much, but it was home. Rosanna had come to America from Brazil 5 years earlier on a temporary visa, bringing her 4-year-old son with her in search of a better life and running from an abusive relationship with Miguel's father. Like many immigrants, she had overstayed. Her visa, living in the shadows of American society while working tirelessly as a cleaner for wealthy families in the Belmead area. For a while, they had managed. Rosanna worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week, while Miguel attended public school, quickly picking up English and excelling in his studies despite the language barrier. Their tiny apartment was filled with second-hand furniture, but Rosanna had made it feel like a palace to Miguel, decorating it with colorful Brazilian fabrics and photographs of Rio de Janeiro's beaches that she'd never been able to afford to visit when she lived there. But then the chest pains had started. At first, Rosanna dismissed them as exhaustion or stress. She couldn't afford to be sick. There was no health insurance, no safety net for undocumented workers. But when she collapsed while cleaning a mansion in November, her employer had called an ambulance despite Rosanna's tearful protests about the cost. The diagnosis was severe, a heart condition that required ongoing medication and eventual surgery. The hospital provided emergency care and a prescription she couldn't afford to fill. Within weeks, their meager savings were depleted, paying for just a fraction of the hospital bill and the first round of medication. By Christmas, they were evicted from their apartment when the rent went unpaid. For the past 3 weeks, they had been staying at a crowded homeless shelter when they could get beds, which wasn't often in the cold winter months when the shelters filled quickly. On nights they couldn't get in, they slept in bus stations, under bridges, or on park benches, always together, always watchful. Tonight was different, though. Rosanna's condition had worsened, and she had gone to the public hospital for emergency care. She had begged Miguel to go to the youth shelter while she was gone, but the boy refused. The last time they'd been separated, a well-meaning social worker had almost called child services. Miguel understood enough about their precarious situation to know that could mean being taken away from his mother permanently. So here he was, alone in the cold Nashville night, hungry and afraid, but determined to wait for his mother's return. As the evening progressed, Miguel's attention was drawn to the warm glow emanating from an upscale restaurant across the street. The Nashville Melody was famous for its southern cuisine and for the country music celebrities who frequented it. Through the large windows, Miguel could see people in fine clothes, laughing and eating at tables laden with food. His mouth watered as the aromas of fried chicken, biscuits, and gravy wafted across the street whenever the door opened. Earlier, he had approached the back door where kitchen staff occasionally emerged for smoke breaks, hoping for scraps, but a stern-faced manager had shooed him away, threatening to call the police if he loitered there. Now growing desperate as the night grew colder, Miguel watched the front entrance, gathering his courage. He had learned over the past weeks that direct appeals sometimes worked where hovering in the background failed. Some people, when faced with a hungry child asking for food directly, found it harder to turn away. Miguel had dreams that kept him going through these hard times. He dreamed of his mother being healthy again, of having a real home with a bed of his own. He dreamed of returning to school where he had been doing so well in math, his favorite subject. Most of all, he dreamed of a day when they wouldn't have to be afraid anymore, afraid of deportation, afraid of separation, afraid of hunger and cold. These dreams seemed increasingly distant as their situation worsened, but Miguel held onto them fiercely. His mother had always told him, "Soñar é o primeiro passo para realizar." Dreaming is the first step toward achievement. Even now, in their darkest hours, he refused to let go of hope. It was this hope that propelled him forward when he saw a well-dressed older man exiting the restaurant alone. The man wore an elegant cowboy hat, a tailored suit, and boots that gleamed under the streetlights. There was something kind about his weathered face, something that gave Miguel the courage to approach him despite previous rejections. Miguel didn't recognize George Strait, the legendary king of country music, with more #1 hits than any artist in history. To the boy, he was simply a man who might have enough compassion to spare a piece of bread. Gathering his courage, Miguel crossed the street, his heart pounding. As he approached, he rehearsed the English phrases he had practiced. When the man was just a few steps away, Miguel stepped forward, his thin frame trembling from cold and nervousness. "Sir," he said in his accented English, Could you give me a piece of bread? I not eat today." The words hung in the frosty air between them, and for a heart-stopping moment Miguel thought the man would simply walk past him like so many others had done. But instead, George Strait stopped and turned his full attention to the small boy standing before him. The country legend's eyes, crinkled at the corners from years of smiling, took in the boy's disheveled appearance, the worn clothes, the dirty face, and most tellingly, the look of desperate hunger that no child should ever wear. In his decades-long career, George had seen poverty in many forms, had risen from modest beginnings himself, and had never forgotten the value of compassion. He bent down slightly, meeting Miguel at eye level, a gesture that immediately set the boy at ease. There was no condescension in the movement, only respect. "What's your name, son?" George asked, his voice carrying the warm Texas drawl that millions of fans recognized instantly. "Miguel, sir. I from Brazil," the boy replied, still shivering. As they stood there on the sidewalk, neither could have imagined how this simple interaction would change both their lives forever. Miguel, hoping for perhaps $1 or a piece of bread, and George, touched by a child's plight in a way that would awaken something profound within him. Rosana Oliveira had always taught her son to be honest, hard-working and kind, even when life was unkind to them. "Nosso caráter é tudo que ninguém pode tirar de nós," she would tell him. "Our character is the one thing no one can take from us." Despite their circumstances, she had instilled in Miguel a sense of dignity that shone through his tattered clothes and hungry face. This dignity wasn't lost on George Strait, who had built his career not just on musical talent, but on values of integrity and straightforwardness. Unlike many celebrities who might have offered a quick $20 bill and continued on their way, George found himself unable to simply walk away from this child. "When did you last eat, Miguel?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Yesterday." "Morning, sir. Small muffin," Miguel answered honestly, his eyes downcast. He wasn't accustomed to asking for help, and shame colored his cheeks, despite the cold that had turned them red already. George Strait's hand went to his pocket, but he stopped himself. Money alone wasn't going to solve this boy's problems. That much was clear. There was a story here, one that needed to be heard. "Are you here alone? Where's your family?" George asked gently. Miguel hesitated. His mother had always warned him about revealing too much to strangers, especially about their undocumented status. But something about this man's kind eyes made Miguel trust him. My mother, she in hospital. She has sick heart. He struggled for the words. "We no have home now. 3 months we lose apartment when she stop work." The simplicity of the statement belied the tragedy it contained. A sick mother, a homeless child, alone in a foreign country without support. It was a situation that struck George deeply. The country singer looked around at the busy street. Nashville's entertainment district was packed with tourists and locals enjoying the nightlife, oblivious to the drama unfolding on the sidewalk before them. Several people had recognized George and were watching the interaction from a respectful distance, curious about the shabby-looking boy who had approached their idol. George made a decision then, one that came from the heart rather than from careful consideration. "Miguel, I'm not just going to give you bread. I'm going to make sure you get a proper meal. Would you join me inside?" Miguel's eyes widened in disbelief. The Nashville Melody was clearly an expensive restaurant, the kind his mother would have cleaned but never eaten in. "Inside? But He looked down at his dirty clothes and worn sneakers. "Don't you worry about that," George reassured him with a warm smile. "I know the owner. You'll be my special guest tonight." As they turned back toward the restaurant, neither Miguel nor George could have predicted the chain of events that would follow. For Miguel, it was simply the promise of a warm meal after a day of hunger. For George Strait, it was an impulse of kindness that would soon evolve into something much more significant. The hostess at the Nashville Melody did a double take when George Strait returned with the disheveled boy in tow. Her professional smile faltered slightly, but a quick, meaningful look from George was enough to prevent any comment on Miguel's appearance. "Table for 2, please, Angela," George said pleasantly, but firmly. "Somewhere quiet would be nice." "Of course, Mr. Strait," the hostess replied, quickly regaining her composure. "Right this way." As they followed her through the restaurant, Miguel felt the stares of the other diners. He had learned to make himself invisible on the streets, a survival skill for a homeless child. But here, in this elegant space with crystal glasses catching the light from chandeliers, invisibility was impossible. He walked close to George, taking comfort in the man's solid presence beside him. They were seated in a corner booth, somewhat shielded from the curious gazes of other patrons. George ensured Miguel was comfortable before sitting down himself. "Order anything you want, son," George said, handing the boy a menu. "The chicken fried steak here is about the best in Tennessee, if you're asking my opinion." Miguel held the heavy, leather-bound menu with reverent hands, overwhelmed by the options and prices he could barely comprehend. The kindness of this stranger was almost too much to bear, and tears welled in his eyes despite his best effort to contain them. George noticed, but pretended not to, giving the boy a moment to collect himself. It was a kindness Miguel wouldn't forget, the gift of dignity in a moment of overwhelming emotion. "You like fried chicken? Mashed potatoes?" George asked, helping Miguel navigate the unfamiliar terrain of the upscale menu. When the boy nodded enthusiastically, George smiled. "Then that's what we'll get you, a proper southern meal to warm you up." As they waited for their food, George gently drew out Miguel's story. The boy, initially hesitant, gradually opened up about his life in Brazil, their journey to America, and the series of hardships that had left them homeless. He spoke of his mother with such love and worry that George found himself deeply moved. "She works so hard, sir. 3, sometimes 4 houses to clean every day. She never complains, even when her hands crack and bleed from the chemicals." Miguel's English improved as he grew more comfortable, revealing an intelligence and maturity beyond his years. When she got sick, she still tried to work. I begged her to rest, but she said, "Quem vai pagar as contas?" Who will pay the bills? By the time their food arrived, a feast of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, collard greens, and freshly baked rolls that made Miguel's eyes widen in disbelief. George Strait had made up his mind that this chance encounter was going to be more than just a meal. Miguel ate slowly at first, then with increasing abandon, as his body demanded the nourishment it had been denied. George encouraged him gently, ensuring he didn't make himself sick by eating too quickly, all while formulating a plan that would soon change the course of multiple lives. Outside the restaurant windows, Nashville continued its evening rhythm, unaware that within its pulsing heart, an extraordinary act of kindness was unfolding, one that would ripple outward in ways no one could yet imagine. As Miguel savored the last bite of the best meal he'd had in months, he noticed George Strait discreetly checking his watch. The country legend had been nothing but kind, asking thoughtful questions about Miguel's life and listening with genuine interest to the answers. But now, as the dishes were cleared away, Miguel felt a familiar anxiety creeping back. Soon, this brief respite would end, and he would return to the cold streets to wait for his mother. "Sir, thank you for the food," Miguel said softly, preparing himself to leave. "I go now. You are a very kind man." George Strait studied the boy carefully. Through their conversation, he had learned much more about Miguel's situation, how his mother, Rosanna, had been denied proper medical care due to her undocumented status, how Miguel had stopped attending school when they lost their apartment, how they had been surviving on the kindness of strangers and occasional access to overcrowded shelters. "Miguel, when is your mother expected to be released from the hospital?" George asked, the boy's brow furrowed in concentration. "The nurse, she told maybe tonight or tomorrow morning. I wait for her at the hospital before, but security guard, he make me leave. Say I cannot stay in waiting room all night." George nodded thoughtfully. The story was becoming clearer and more troubling by the minute. "And where were you planning to meet her?" "At the bus stop near hospital," Miguel replied. "We sleep there before. It has roof if rain comes." The matter-of-fact way the child described his plans for spending a freezing January night at a bus stop stirred something deep within George Strait. Throughout his long career, the country star had seen both the best and worst of American life. He'd risen from humble beginnings in Texas, worked cattle ranches before becoming famous, and never forgot the value of hard work and community. But he'd also witnessed the way society often overlooked its most vulnerable members, especially those who fell through the cracks of the system. "I have a better idea," George said, making a decision. "How about we go find your mother together? No one should have to spend the night at a bus stop in this weather." Miguel's eyes widened. "Really? You would help find my?" "Really," George confirmed with a warm smile. "Let me make a few calls first." As George stepped away to use his phone, Miguel sat back in the plush booth, hardly believing the turn his evening had taken. Just hours ago, he had been approached by the restaurant's security guard, a stern-faced man named Darrell who had made it clear that street kids weren't welcome anywhere near the establishment. Earlier that evening, Miguel had been watching the restaurant from across the street, gathering courage to approach and ask for food. He had tried several other establishments first, but had been shooed away like an unwanted stray. At one pizzeria, a manager had threatened to call the police when Miguel had timidly asked if they had any leftover slices they would otherwise throw away. When he finally crossed the street to the Nashville Melody, the security guard spotted him immediately. "Hey, kid!" Darrell had called out sharply. "This isn't a soup kitchen. Move along before I have to make you move." Miguel had tried to explain that he was just hungry, not causing trouble, but Darrell wasn't interested. I don't care if you haven't eaten in a week. This is a high-class establishment. The customers don't come here to be hassled by beggars. A small crowd of patrons waiting to enter the restaurant had witnessed the exchange. Most avoided eye contact with Miguel, some whispering to each other with looks of discomfort or disdain. One woman in an expensive fur coat had vocally supported the guard, saying, "Really, there should be better enforcement downtown. These people are everywhere these days. These people," as if Miguel and others like him were a different species entirely. A well-dressed businessman had been particularly cruel, loudly suggesting that the boy was probably working for a gang of thieves who used children to identify targets. "Don't be fooled by the innocent act," he'd announced to no one in particular. "I read about this scam in the newspaper." Red-faced with shame, Miguel had retreated across the street, fighting back tears. He wasn't a thief or a scammer. He was just a hungry boy trying to survive until his mother could get back on her feet. The casual cruelty had stung worse than the hunger pangs in his stomach. For nearly an hour, he had huddled in the shadows, watching people come and go from the restaurant. He observed how the security guard fawned over certain guests, those who arrived in luxury cars or were recognized as local celebrities. He saw how differently people could be treated based on their appearance and perceived status. It was only when he spotted George Strait leaving alone that Miguel made one last desperate attempt. Something about the man's demeanor, the way he thanked the doorman and seemed to look people in the eye regardless of their station, gave Miguel hope that this person might be different. Now, as George returned from making his calls, Miguel could hardly believe his instincts had been so right. "Good news," George announced, sliding back into the booth. "I spoke with the hospital. Your mother is being prepared for discharge right now. They were going to release her tonight regardless, but I've arranged for a taxi to bring her here instead of having her find her own way out in the cold." Miguel's eyes filled with tears. "She coming here? To this restaurant?" "That's right," George confirmed, "and I've taken care of her hospital bill too." This was too much for Miguel to process. "But why?" "Why you help us?" George's weathered face softened. "Because everyone needs a helping hand sometimes, son. I've been fortunate in my life, but I remember when things weren't so easy. And your mother sounds like a woman who's done everything she can to give you a good life under impossible circumstances. She deserves some help." As they waited for Rosanna to arrive, George noticed the security guard, Darrell, watching their table with a puzzled expression. When their eyes met, the guard quickly looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the sight of the country music legend sharing a table with the very child he had chased away earlier. George excused himself briefly and walked over to the man. Their conversation was brief but intense. Though Miguel couldn't hear the words exchanged, he saw Darrell's face change from defensive to embarrassed, and finally to something like shame. When George returned to the table, he didn't mention the conversation, instead asking Miguel about his schooling and what subjects he enjoyed most. "Math," Miguel replied without hesitation. "And science. I like to learn how things work." George nodded approvingly. "Those are good fields to be interested in. Plenty of opportunity there. My teacher, Mrs. Henderson, she say I have aptitude," Miguel said proudly, pronouncing the difficult word carefully. "Before we lose apartment, she give me extra books to study. I still have them. My wouldn't let me leave them, even when we had to carry everything we own." George was about to respond when the restaurant door opened, and a frail woman entered, looking disoriented and exhausted. She wore hospital scrubs that had been given to her when her own clothes proved too dirty to return, and a thin jacket that provided little protection against the January cold. "My!" Miguel cried out, jumping from his seat and rushing toward her. Rosanna Oliveira's tired face transformed at the sight of her son. Despite her obvious weakness, she knelt to embrace him, murmuring Portuguese endearments and checking him over as if to ensure he hadn't been harmed in their hours apart. Miguel, meu filho, you're okay? You eat something? Her accent was thicker than her son's, her English more hesitant. Yes, this nice man buy me dinner, the best food ever. Miguel turned to point at George, who had stood respectfully when Rosanna entered. Rosanna's eyes widened as she took in the famous face that even she, with limited exposure to American culture, recognized. Immediately she became flustered, straightening her hospital-issued clothes self-consciously. Mr. Strait, my son, he bother you? I so sorry. George stepped forward, extending his hand. Please, ma'am, your son has been no bother at all. It's been my pleasure to have dinner with such a fine young man. I'd be honored if you'd join us. Rosanna hesitated, looking around at the upscale restaurant where she would normally only enter. As cleaning staff, she was acutely aware of her appearance and the stares from other diners. I'm not dressed for... Nonsense, George interrupted gently. I own a ranch in Texas. I've come to plenty of fancy places covered in dust and worse. Please sit down and have something to eat. You look like you could use a good meal. His matter-of-fact kindness broke through Rosanna's hesitation. With a grateful nod, she allowed herself to be led to the table where her son had been dining, with one of country music's biggest stars. As Rosanna ate the food George ordered for her, she gradually shared more of their story. She had been a teacher in Brazil, but had fled an abusive relationship with Miguel's father, who had powerful family connections that made it impossible for her to find protection through legal channels. Coming to America on a visitor visa had been her desperate attempt to give her son a life free from fear. I plan to do everything legal, she explained earnestly. Save money, apply for asylum proper way, but lawyer costs so much, and papers, documents. She shook her head sadly. Then time pass, visa expire, and I afraid to come forward. If we sent back... She didn't finish the sentence, but the fear in her eyes said everything about what might await them in Brazil. George listened intently, asking questions that showed a nuanced understanding of immigration issues. Unlike many celebrities who might view such matters through the simplistic lens of political talking points, George's questions revealed a thoughtful engagement with the real human complexities involved. Your heart condition, he said after a while. The doctor gave you a diagnosis? Rosanna nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to her chest. Cardiomyopathy. They say I need medicine every day and maybe operation later, but no insurance, so she shrugged, as if to say what more could she do. George's expression darkened. And they just discharged you? Without ensuring you had the medication or follow-up care? They give me prescription, Rosanna said, pulling a crumpled paper from her pocket. Say I should fill it and come back to clinic in 2 weeks, but medicine cost $300. She laughed humorlessly. I have $7.23. Throughout the conversation, Miguel watched his mother with worried eyes. Though young, he understood enough to know that her condition was serious, life-threatening if untreated. He had heard her coughing at night, had seen her struggle to catch her breath after walking just a few blocks. The fear of losing her was a constant companion, far worse than the hunger or cold. George saw the boy's concern and recognized in it a maturity forced upon him by circumstances. No child should have to worry about whether their parent would survive the night, whether they would have a place to sleep, or where their next meal would come from. Yet millions did, even in this land of plenty. As their conversation continued, the restaurant had gradually emptied of other patrons. The manager approached their table hesitantly, clearing his throat. Mr. Strait, I hate to interrupt, but we'll be closing in about 15 minutes. George nodded. Thank you, Mark. Please add their meals to my bill and have the kitchen prepare some food for them to take away. The manager nodded, casting a curious glance at Rosanna and Miguel before walking away. Now, George said, turning back to Rosanna, we need to figure out where you two are going to stay tonight. Rosanna straightened her shoulders. Despite her exhaustion and illness, her pride was evident. "We find shelter or bus station. Please, you've done too much already." "With all due respect, ma'am," George replied firmly but kindly, "it's about 25 degrees out there tonight. The shelters are all full. I checked while you were eating, and I'm not about to let a sick woman and a child spend the night in a bus station if I can help it." Miguel watched this exchange with bated breath. His mother was proud, too proud. Sometimes, even in their direst moments, she had been reluctant to accept charity, preferring to frame any assistance as temporary loans or exchanges for work she would perform. "I have a suite at the Hermitage Hotel," George continued. "It has 2 bedrooms. I hardly use the second one. You and Miguel could stay there tonight, get a proper rest, and tomorrow we can sort out something more permanent." Rosanna began to protest, but George held up a hand. "Please, Miss Oliveira, consider it not just for yourself, but for Miguel. And if it helps, you can consider it a loan. When you're back on your feet, you can pay it forward by helping someone else in need." At the mention of her son, Rosanna's resistance crumbled. She looked at Miguel, at the hope blooming in his eyes, and slowly nodded. "One night," she conceded, "and tomorrow I find work to repay." George smiled, knowing better than to argue further for now. One night is a fine start. As they prepared to leave, George excused himself one more time to speak with the manager. Miguel watched as money changed hands, more money than the boy had ever seen at once, and several large bags of food were brought from the kitchen. When they stepped outside, the security guard, Darrell, stood awkwardly by the door. To Miguel's surprise, the man addressed him directly. "Hey, kid. Miguel. I wanted to say, I'm sorry about earlier. I was out of line." He glanced at George, then back to the boy. "Not everyone gets second chances to do the right thing. Thanks for giving me one." Miguel, raised to be polite despite any grievance, nodded shyly. "Is okay. You just doing your job?" The guard shook his head. "No, my job is to provide security, not to be cruel to a hungry child. There's a difference." He extended a hand to Miguel, who shook it solemnly, understanding that something important had transpired. As they walked toward the waiting limousine, another surprise George had arranged, Miguel felt his mother's arm around his shoulders, holding him close as if to reassure herself that he was really there, that they were both safe, at least for tonight. The boy looked up at the star-filled Tennessee sky, then at the country music legend walking beside them with bags of food in his hands, and thought perhaps his mother had been right all along. Dreams were indeed the first step toward achievement, and tonight, in the most unexpected way, one of his dreams had come true. They would sleep warm and safe together. What Miguel couldn't know was that this night was just the beginning. George, Strait, moved beyond words by their plight, had already set in motion plans that would change not only Miguel and Rosanna's lives, but also his own in profound and lasting ways. The limousine glided through Nashville's nighttime streets, its quiet luxury a stark contrast to the life Miguel and Rosanna had been living. Inside, Miguel pressed his face against the window, watching the city lights blur past with undisguised wonder. He had never been in such a vehicle before, had only seen them in movies or passing by with their tinted windows concealing the important people inside. Now he was one of those people, at least for tonight. Beside him, Rosanna sat stiffly, her posture betraying her discomfort with their circumstances. Though grateful for George Strait's kindness, accepting help went against everything she had taught herself over the years of struggling alone. Her eyes darted occasionally to the country music star seated across from them, trying to fathom his motivations. "Your hotel is very expensive, no?" she asked hesitantly, her hand unconsciously clutching the small plastic bag containing her prescription and discharge papers. George smiled reassuringly. The Hermitage is one of Nashville's historic hotels. Beautiful place. But please don't worry about the cost, Ms. Oliveira. I'm fortunate enough that it's not a concern. But why? She persisted, needing to understand. Why you help us? Many people see Miguel hungry, see me sick. They look away, turn backs. It is normal. The last words were spoken with a resignation that revealed how accustomed she had become to society's indifference. George considered her question carefully. In truth, he wasn't entirely sure himself why this particular encounter had affected him so deeply. Throughout his career, he had contributed to numerous charities, established foundations, and performed at benefit concerts. But this direct intervention in individual lives was something different, more personal, more immediate. I suppose, he said finally, it's because there's a difference between knowing that problems exist in the abstract and seeing them right in front of you. When Miguel asked me for bread, he wasn't just a statistic or a news story about homelessness. He was a real boy with real hunger, and now that I know both of you, I can't pretend I don't. Rosanna nodded slowly, understanding. In Brazil, we have saying, "Quem vê cara não vê coração." Who sees the face doesn't see the heart. Maybe you are man who sees both. The limousine pulled up to the grand entrance of the Hermitage Hotel, its 1920s Italian Renaissance. Architecture illuminated majestically against the night sky. As they stepped out, Miguel gasped audibly at the ornate facade. "It looks like a palace, man," he whispered in Portuguese. The lobby was even more impressive. A magnificent space, with a painted glass ceiling, marble columns, and ornate details that spoke of a bygone era of elegance. Miguel and Rosanna stood in awe, suddenly acutely aware of their disheveled appearance amidst such splendor. The night manager approached immediately, greeting George with the deference reserved for valued repeat guests. If he noticed the unusual appearance of George's companions, he gave no indication. "Mr. Strait, welcome back. Your suite is ready as always. Would you like any assistance with your guests' accommodations?" George placed a gentle hand on Miguel's shoulder. "Thank you, James. Ms. Oliveira and her son will be staying in the second bedroom of my suite tonight. Please ensure that breakfast for 3 is arranged for tomorrow morning, say around 9 o'clock. "Of course, sir. And would you like me to have housekeeping send up any additional toiletries or necessities for your guests?" George glanced at Rosanna, who clearly had nothing with her but the clothes on her back and her hospital papers. "Yes, please. The full complement of toiletries and perhaps some robes and slippers would be appreciated." As they made their way to the elevator, Miguel noticed several guests in the lobby openly staring at them. He heard whispers, caught fragments of comments. "Isn't that George Strait? Who are those people with him? They look homeless," and felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. But George walked confidently, nodding politely to those who caught his eye, treating Rosanna and Miguel not as charity cases, but as valued companions. His natural dignity seemed to extend to them, a protective bubble against the curious and sometimes judgmental gazes. The elevator attendant, an older gentleman named Howard according to his nameplate, operated the controls with white-gloved hands. "Good evening, Mr. Strait. Penthouse suite, I presume." "Yes, thank you, Howard," George replied warmly. "How's that granddaughter of yours? Still playing softball?" Howard beamed. "Made the all-state team last week, sir. She's hoping for a college scholarship next year." "That's wonderful. Tell her congratulations from me." This brief, genuine interaction spoke volumes about George's character. Despite his fame, he remembered the details of hotel employees' lives, treated them with authentic interest and respect. Miguel observed this carefully, filing it away as a lesson in how a true gentleman behaved. The penthouse suite took Miguel's breath away. The spacious living area featured plush furnishings, a magnificent view of Nashville through floor to ceiling. windows and elegantly appointed details that spoke of luxury without ostentation. For a boy who had been sleeping under bridges and in bus stations, it seemed impossibly opulent. "The second bedroom is through there," George indicated, pointing to a door off the main living space. "It has its own bathroom. Make yourselves at home, and please help yourselves to anything in the kitchen area or minibar." Rosanna stood in the center of the room, still clutching her plastic bag of medical papers like a lifeline. "This is too much," she whispered, overwhelmed by the contrast between this luxury and their recent living conditions. "It's just right," George countered gently. "Now you both must be exhausted. Why don't you get cleaned up and settled in? We can talk more in the morning." A knock at the door announced the arrival of the toiletries and robes George had requested. Along with them came a hotel employee carrying several shopping bags. "The night manager took the liberty of having these brought up, Mr. Strait," the young woman explained. "He thought your guests might appreciate some clean clothes for tomorrow." George tipped her generously, and when she had gone, explored the bag's contents. They contained basic clothing items: jeans, t-shirts, sweaters, undergarments, and even a pair of sneakers for Miguel that looked to be about the right size. "James has always been exceptionally thoughtful," George commented. "Please take these. Consider them a part of the hotel's hospitality." Rosanna began to protest, but the sight of the clean clothes, the first new items they would have had in months, proved too tempting. With a grateful nod, she accepted the gifts. Once Miguel and his mother had retreated to their room to clean up, George sank into the living room sofa, lost in thought. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, one that stirred long dormant feelings and memories. George Strait had always been known in the music industry as a private man, one who kept his personal life separate from his public persona. Few fans knew of the tragedies that had shaped him. The loss of his daughter Jennifer in a car accident in 1986 when she was just 13, a devastating blow that had nearly ended his career and had certainly changed his perspective on what truly mattered in life. In the years since, George and his wife Norma had channeled their grief into quiet philanthropy, establishing a foundation in their daughter's memory that supported children's charities. But they rarely spoke publicly about these efforts, preferring to let the work speak for itself. Now, faced with Miguel and Rosanna's desperate situation, George felt an echo of the protective paternal instinct that had never diminished, despite the years since Jennifer's passing. There was something about Miguel's resilience, his quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming hardship, that touched George deeply. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Norma, sorry to wake you, darling." His voice softened as it always did when speaking to his wife of nearly 5 decades. "Something's happened here in Nashville. I've met some folks who need help, real help, not just a handout." He described Miguel and Rosanna's situation, the boy's hunger, the mother's illness, their precarious immigration status. Norma Strait had always been her husband's moral compass, his partner in all decisions, major and minor. Her response was immediate and characteristic. "What do they need, and how can we help?" By the time Miguel and Rosanna emerged from their room, both looking transformed by hot showers and clean clothes, George had formulated the beginnings of a plan. Miguel's hair was still damp, his face scrubbed clean, revealing a handsome boy whose cheeks had begun to fill out just from the proper meal he'd had earlier. Rosanna, despite her exhaustion and illness, carried herself with natural grace, her resemblance to her son more apparent now that layers of stress and grime had been washed away. "You both look refreshed," George observed kindly. "Feeling better?" "Yes, thank you, sir," Miguel replied, his eyes still wide with wonder at their surroundings. "The shower had buttons I never saw before, and the towels are so soft." George chuckled at the boy's innocent delight in what most would consider basic amenities. "Why don't we sit down? There are some things I'd like to discuss with you both if you're not too tired." Rosanna nodded, perching cautiously on the edge of a chair as if afraid to fully commit her weight to the expensive furniture. Miguel sat beside her, automatically reaching for her hand, a gesture of support that belied their reversed roles. In many ways, the boy had become caretaker to his ailing mother. "Ms. Oliveira," George began, but was gently interrupted. "Please, call me Rosanna." "Rosanna, then, and you can call me George," he replied with a warm smile. "I've been thinking about your situation. The immediate concerns are your health, a safe place to stay, and Miguel's education. But there's also the matter of your immigration status, which complicates everything." Rosanna tensed visibly at the mention of her undocumented status. "You will report us?" she asked, fear evident in her voice. "No, absolutely not," George assured her firmly. "But we need to address it if we're going to find a permanent solution. Temporary help is important, but it won't solve the underlying problems you're facing." "We?" Rosanna questioned, picking up on the pronoun. "Mr. Strait, George, you have done so much already. One night in beautiful hotel, clothes, food, is more than anyone ever do." George leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Rosanna, I believe people come into our lives for a reason. Meeting Miguel tonight wasn't chance, it was an opportunity. An opportunity for me to help, yes, but also an opportunity for me to learn and remember what's truly important." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I lost my daughter years ago. She was about Miguel's age. The confession came quietly, without dramatization, but the pain behind the words was unmistakable. Since then, my wife Norma and I have tried to honor her memory by helping children when we can, usually through foundations and charities, which is important work, but sometimes a more direct approach is needed." Miguel, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Your daughter died." "I'm very sorry, sir." The simple, sincere condolence from a child who had so little yet offered compassion so freely brought a lump to George's throat. "Thank you, son. Her name was Jennifer. She would have been 42 this year." Rosanna crossed herself instinctively, a gesture of respect for the mentioned dead. "No parent should lose child," she said softly. "Is greatest pain possible?" "It is," George agreed. "And it taught me that life is precious and often shorter than we expect. It taught me not to waste time when there's good to be done." He straightened, his tone becoming more practical. "So here's what I propose. I have a small guest house on my ranch in Texas. It's nothing fancy, but it's comfortable and private. I'd like to offer it to you both until we can get your situation sorted out properly." Rosanna's eyes widened in disbelief. "Guest house? On your ranch? But why would you do this?" "Because you need it, and I can provide it," George replied, simply. "The guest house has been sitting empty, except for occasional visitors. My wife agrees that you should use it while we work on more permanent solutions." "Solutions?" Miguel asked, hope creeping into his voice. George nodded. "I have friends who are immigration attorneys, good ones who have helped other families navigate the complex process of regularizing their status, and I know doctors who can provide the care Rosanna needs, regardless of insurance status." He looked directly at Rosanna. "I'm not promising miracles. Immigration law is complicated, and your health issues are serious, but I am promising that you won't have to face these challenges alone anymore." Tears welled in Rosanna's eyes. "I don't know what to say. It's too much." "You don't need to say anything right now," George assured her. "Just get some rest tonight. In the morning we'll start making arrangements, one step at a time." Miguel, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly blurted out, "Can I go back to school?" The question, so innocent and fundamental, hit both adults with its poignancy. Here was a child who, despite homelessness and hunger, prioritized education. The key to the future his mother had sacrificed everything to give him. "Yes, Miguel," George answered, his voice rough with emotion. "Getting you back in school will be one of our first priorities." Later, after Rosanna and Miguel had retired to their bedroom, George stood at the penthouse windows, gazing out at the Nashville skyline. The city glittered below, its famous music venues and honky-tonks still, pulsing with life even as midnight approached. Somewhere out there were countless others like Miguel and Rosanna, people with dreams, potential, and basic human dignity who had fallen through society's cracks. He couldn't help them all. No one person could. But he could help these two and, perhaps in doing so, inspire others to look beyond their comfortable bubbles and see the real human beings struggling just beyond their peripheral vision. His phone buzzed with a text from Norma. "Guest house being prepared. Dr. Martinez can see her next week. All my love to you and our new friends." George smiled at his wife's immediate acceptance of his decision to help. After 49 years of marriage, they still operated as a single unit, their values and instincts perfectly aligned. He texted back a simple, "Thank you, darling," and slipped the phone back into his pocket. In the bedroom, Miguel lay awake despite the unprecedented comfort of the hotel bed. The events of the day swirled in his mind. The hunger, the desperation, the chance encounter with a kind stranger who turned out to be a famous singer, and now this unbelievable offer of help that could change everything for him and his mother. "Mine," he whispered, unsure if she was still awake. "Sim, filho," came Rosanna's soft reply. "Do you think Mr. Strait really means it? About the guest house and the lawyers and everything?" Rosanna was silent for a moment. "I think," she said finally, "that God sends angels sometimes. Not with wings like in pictures, but real people who have kind hearts. Tonight, he sent us George Strait." Miguel considered this. He wasn't sure about angels, but he knew that for the first time in months he felt safe. His mother was beside him. They were warm and clean and fed, and tomorrow held promise instead of dread. "I'm going to study extra hard when I go back to school," he declared, "and someday, when I grow up, I'm going to help people too, just like Mr. Strait." "I know you will, meu amor," Rosanna murmured, reaching out to stroke his hair. "I have always known this about you. You have good heart." As they drifted off to sleep, neither could have imagined how their lives would transform in the coming months, or how their chance encounter with George Strait would ripple outward, touching not just their lives but countless others, in ways yet to be revealed. The small guest house on George Strait's Texas ranch sat nestled among sprawling live oak trees, its limestone exterior gleaming softly in the morning sun. Though modest compared to the main residence visible in the distance, it was immaculately maintained, with a welcoming front porch adorned with potted wildflowers and comfortable rocking chairs. For Miguel and Rosanna, who had arrived the previous evening after a private flight from Nashville on George's plane, it might as well have been a palace. The two-bedroom cottage with its fully equipped kitchen, cozy living room, and pristine bathrooms represented a level of stability they hadn't experienced in months. "Miguel, come eat breakfast," Rosanna called from the kitchen, where she was arranging fresh fruit on a plate beside the pancakes Norma Strait had delivered earlier. Though still weak from her heart condition, 2 weeks of proper medical care, nutrition, and rest had already improved her color and energy. Miguel bounded in from the second bedroom, his face bright with excitement. There's a horse outside, a real horse right outside my window." Rosanna smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "Eat first, then maybe we ask Mrs. Strait if you can see. The horse is closer. Remember what doctors say, you too skinny still. Need to gain more weight." The boy obediently sat at the small kitchen table and began eating with gusto. The hollow look that had haunted his features during their homeless period was gradually filling out, his natural vibrancy returning with each proper meal and restful night. A gentle knock at the door announced Norma Strait's arrival. In the 2 weeks since they'd come to the ranch, George's wife had proven herself to be as kind and down-to-earth as her famous husband. In her early 70s, Norma carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had weathered life's greatest storms without losing her essential warmth. "Good morning," she called as Rosanna opened the door. "I see the pancakes were a hit." She nodded toward Miguel, who waved with a mouthful of food. "They are delicious." "Thank you, Mrs. Strait," Rosanna said, still not entirely comfortable with the casual American style of addressing people by their first names, especially someone she respected as much as Norma. "Please, it's Norma, remember?" She smiled warmly. "I came by to let you know that Dr. Ramirez confirmed your appointment for tomorrow at 10. George and I will drive you into San Antonio." Rosanna nodded, a flicker of anxiety crossing her face. Though grateful for the specialized cardiac care she was receiving at George's arrangement, each doctor's visit reminded her of the precariousness of their situation. Without insurance, such medical attention would have been completely beyond reach, and despite George's assurances, she couldn't shake the fear that her undocumented status might be discovered during one of these appointments. Norma, perceptive as always, noticed Rosanna's unease. "Robert Davidson, our friend who's handling your immigration case, will be joining us for dinner tonight," she said. "He has some updates he'd like to discuss with you." At the mention of the immigration attorney, Miguel perked up. "Is it good news? Will we get to stay in America?" "Miguel," Rosanna admonished gently, "is not polite to ask such direct questions." Norma laughed. "It's perfectly fine. And I think Robert does have some encouraging developments to share, but I'll let him explain the details." She turned to Miguel with a conspiratorial smile. "Now, I couldn't help overhearing something about horses when I was coming up the path. George is checking on the new foal that was born last week. Would you like to join him in the stables after breakfast?" The boy's face lit up as if illuminated. From within. "Really? I can see the baby horse." "Of course. George mentioned he could use a good assistant this morning, someone with careful hands and a gentle voice. Know anyone who fits that description?" Miguel looked to his mother for permission, his expression so hopeful that Rosanna couldn't possibly refuse, despite her ingrained caution about imposing on their host's generosity. "Yes, you may go, after you finish every bite and help clear. Dishes," she stipulated, hiding a smile as Miguel immediately began eating with renewed determination. 30 minutes later, Miguel was walking alongside George Strait through the immaculate stables, trying his best to contain his excitement to the dignified level that seemed appropriate when accompanying such a respected figure. The stables housed 12 horses, each in spacious stalls with their names displayed on engraved plaques. "This here is Whiskey," George said, pausing by a magnificent chestnut quarter horse who nickered softly at his approach. "He's been with me for 11 years. Now, best cutting horse I've ever owned." Miguel looked up at the impressive animal with wonder. "What is cutting horse?" George smiled, always happy to share his knowledge of horses and ranching. "Cutting is when a horse and rider separate a single cow from the herd and keep it away. It's an old ranching skill that became a competitive sport. These horses are special. They can anticipate a cow's movements, almost like they can read their minds." He reached out and stroked Whiskey's neck affectionately. "Want to give him a treat? He's gentle." Miguel nodded eagerly, and George placed a small apple in the boy's open palm. "Keep your hand flat like this," he demonstrated. "He'll take it nice and easy." The soft velvet of the horse's lips against his palm, as Whiskey delicately took the offered apple, made Miguel giggle with delight. "His mouth tickles." "That's how you know he likes you," George said, pleased by the boy's natural affinity with the animals. "Come on, let's go meet our newest addition." At the end of the stable corridor, a mare and her foal occupied a larger stall bedded with extra straw. The foal, all spindly legs and curious eyes, peeked out from behind its mother as they approached. "This is Starlight and her colt," George explained in a hushed tone. "He's just 6 days old, doesn't have a name yet." Miguel stared in awe at the baby horse. "He is so beautiful," he whispered. "Like a dream." "He is, isn't he?" George agreed. "Every new foal is a kind of miracle, a reminder that life goes on, that there's always something new and hopeful coming into the world." The boy nodded, seeming to understand the deeper meaning behind George's words. For several minutes, they stood in companionable silence, watching the tender interactions between mare and foal. Finally, Miguel spoke. "Mr. Strait, can I ask you something?" "Of course, son. Anything." "When I grow up, could I work with horses too? Like, have a job with them?" George considered the question seriously, respecting the boy's earnest inquiry. "With dedication and learning, absolutely. There are many careers with horses, training them, caring for their health as a veterinarian, breeding them, working as a farrier who shoes them, or even teaching others to ride." "I want to learn everything," Miguel declared, with the certainty only a child could muster. "I never saw horses in real life before coming here. In Brazil, my mother and I lived in city, in apartment building, no animals allowed. Then in Nashville, we just saw horses sometimes pulling carriages for tourists." George nodded thoughtfully. "Well, while you're here, I can teach you some basics. If your mother agrees, of course. Learning to care for horses is good discipline. They depend on us completely, so we have to be responsible and consistent." Miguel's face shone with excitement at the prospect. "I will be the most responsible, I promise." George chuckled, recognizing in the boy's enthusiasm echoes of his own childhood passion for horses. He had grown up on a farm in Pearsall, Texas, where his father raised cattle and horses, instilling in young George a love for the ranching life that had never diminished despite his musical success. "I believe you, son. Now want to help me measure out the feed for the morning rounds?" As George guided Miguel through the routine care tasks, teaching him the proper amounts of feed for each horse and how to check water troughs, he found himself impressed by the boy's attentiveness and natural intuition with the animals. Despite his urban upbringing, Miguel seemed to possess an innate understanding of how to approach the horses, calmly, respectfully, without sudden movements or loud noises. "You're a natural," George commented as they finished the morning chores. "Some people never get comfortable around horses, no matter how much they try. But you've got the touch." Miguel beamed at the praise. "I like how they listen. When I talk quiet to them, they turn their ears to hear me, like they care what I say." "They do care," George affirmed. "Horses are excellent judges of character. They can sense fear, anger, or kindness in a person. That's why I've always believed you can tell a lot about someone by how they treat horses and dogs." As they walked back toward the guest house, Miguel grew thoughtful. "Mr. Strait, thank you for helping me and my mother, not just with the house and doctors, but for showing me all this." He gestured at the expansive ranch around them. "I never knew world could be so big and beautiful." The simple sincerity of the statement caught George off guard, reminding him of how limited the boy's experiences had been, how the daily struggle for survival had narrowed his world to the immediate concerns of food, shelter, and safety. "You're welcome, Miguel, but you know, you and your mother have given something to Norma and me too." "What did we give?" Miguel asked, genuinely puzzled. "We have nothing. You've brought life and youth back into our home," George explained. "Since our son George Jr. moved to his own ranch with his family, and with our daughter gone, the place has been too quiet. Having you here, hearing your excitement about everything from horses to pancakes, it reminds us of what's important." Miguel considered this, clearly trying to reconcile how his presence could possibly be a gift to someone like George Strait, who seemed to have everything. "Sometimes," George continued, People think that success and money solve all problems. They don't. The most valuable things in life aren't things at all. They're connections to other people, having purpose and knowing you're making a difference somehow. Before Miguel could respond, they crested the small hill that separated the stables from the guest house, bringing into view the unexpected sight of a black SUV parked in the driveway. A tall man in a tailored suit was just emerging, greeting Norma and Rosanna on the front porch. "Ah, looks like Robert's arrived early," George observed, recognizing their immigration attorney friend. "Let's go hear what news he's brought." As they approached, Miguel could sense the adult's anticipation. Robert Davidson was a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to navigating complex situations. He greeted George warmly and then turned to Miguel with a genuine smile. "You must be Miguel. I've heard a lot about you. Your mother tells me you're quite the scholar." Miguel blushed, surprised that his academic achievements would have been mentioned. "I like school," he admitted. "I miss it." "Well, that's actually part of what I've come to discuss," Robert replied, gesturing toward the house. "Shall we go inside?" Once they were settled in the guest house living room, Robert opened his briefcase and removed several official-looking documents. Rosanna sat perched on the edge of her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Miguel pressed close to her side, sensing the importance of the moment. "I have good news," Robert began without preamble. "After reviewing your case thoroughly, Rosanna, I believe we have a viable path forward through humanitarian parole with a potential adjustment of status afterward." Seeing the confusion on both Rosanna and Miguel's faces, he explained in simpler terms. "Essentially, we can make a strong case that Miguel, as a minor who has spent his formative years in the United States and is excelling academically, would face extreme hardship if returned to Brazil. Additionally, your medical condition, Rosanna, and the lack of comparable affordable treatment in Brazil strengthens the humanitarian aspect of the application." "This means we can stay?" Rosanna asked cautiously. "If approved, and I have good reason to believe it will be, you would receive temporary legal status while we pursue more permanent solutions," Robert confirmed. "It's not guaranteed, and the process will take time, but it's a solid approach." "How long?" Miguel asked, his young mind focused on the practical implications. Robert smiled at the directness of the question. "The initial application processing could take 3 to 6 months. During that time, you can remain here legally. If approved, the humanitarian parole would typically be granted for 1 year, renewable while we work on the next steps." "1 year," Rosanna repeated, her eyes filling with tears of relief. "1 year without hiding, without fear." George, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "And during that time, Miguel can be enrolled in school here locally. We've already spoken with the principal at the elementary school near the ranch. They're ready to welcome him as soon as the paperwork allows." Miguel's eyes widened. "I can go to school here with American children?" "Yes," Norma confirmed gently. "And the school has an excellent ESL program for students who are still perfecting their English, though your language skills are already impressive." The reality of what was happening, that they were being offered not just temporary shelter, but a chance at a legitimate, stable life, seemed to hit Rosanna fully in that moment. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Miguel wrapped his arms around his mother. "Don't cry, Mai. Is good news, yes?" "Yes, Filho," she managed through her tears. "Is happy crying, is gratitude." Robert tactfully busied himself with reorganizing his documents, while Norma discreetly handed Rosanna a tissue. George, moved by the scene but wanting to give them space to process their emotions, suggested that he and Robert step outside to discuss some details. On the porch, the two men spoke quietly. "You're sure about the medical coverage?" George asked. The cardiac surgery she needs is going to be expensive. Robert nodded. The foundation you've established will be able to cover it legally as part of its charitable mission. I've structured everything properly. Besides, Dr. Matthews has already agreed to reduce his fees significantly as a professional courtesy to you. George looked out over his ranch, the land that had been his anchor through decades of fame and travel. You know, when I bought this place, I had this vision of it being filled with family, children, grandchildren, noise and life everywhere. Then, when we lost Jennifer..." He paused, the pain still fresh despite the decades. "Well, plans change. George Jr. has his own place now, his own life. It's been just Norma and me for a long time." Robert, who had known George for over 30 years, understood the unspoken sentiment. Life has a way of bringing us what we need, even if it's not what we originally planned. "That it does," George agreed, watching through the window as Miguel animatedly explained something to his mother, his hands gesturing enthusiastically. "That boy has so much potential. All he needs is a chance." Inside, Miguel was indeed sharing his morning's adventures with the horses, his excitement temporarily overshadowing even the momentous news about their legal status. "And Mr. Strait says I can learn to ride a real horseman. He says I'm a natural because I'm calm, and the horses listen when I talk to them." He paused, suddenly remembering something. "Oh, and the baby horse needs a name. Mr. Strait said everyone on the ranch gets to suggest one, and then they vote. Can I suggest a name too?" Rosanna, her composure recovered, smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "If Mr. and Mrs. Strait say it's okay, then yes. What name you thinking?" Miguel considered seriously. "I think Esperanza. It means hope in Portuguese, because he was born here, in this place where we found hope again." Norma, overhearing, felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple profundity of the suggestion. "That's a beautiful name, Miguel. I think it would be perfect." Later that evening, as the Texas sunset painted the sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink, the unlikely family gathered on the main house's patio for dinner. The conversation flowed easily, Robert sharing stories of his college days with George, Norma discussing her garden plans with Rosanna, and Miguel alternating between eager questions about horses and school. As George looked around the table at these people brought together by chance and choice, he felt a deep sense of rightness. The road ahead for Miguel and Rosanna would not be without challenges. Immigration processes were notoriously complex, and Rosanna's health would require ongoing management. But they had taken the first crucial steps towards stability and legitimacy, and in doing so, they had brought something equally valuable to George and Norma's lives: renewed purpose and the joy of mentorship. In Miguel's eager eyes, George recognized the same passion for life and learning that had characterized his own. Youth, before fame and success and even before tragedy, had shaped his perspective. It was, he reflected, a kind of legacy he hadn't anticipated but welcomed wholeheartedly. Not just the passing on of material resources, but of knowledge, values, and opportunities. A chance to make a tangible difference in individual lives rather than just writing checks to worthy causes. As the stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, George raised his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said simply. "To new beginnings," they echoed, Miguel proudly lifting his glass of lemonade alongside the adults' more traditional beverages. None of them could have predicted exactly where these beginnings would lead, but in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the ranch and the warmth of genuine connection, the future seemed filled with promise. 3 years passed, like the changing Texas seasons, each day bringing new growth, challenges overcome, and memories created. The small guest house that had once seemed so luxurious to Miguel and Rosanna had truly become their home, filled with photographs, schoolwork proudly displayed on the refrigerator, and the accumulated treasures of a stable life. On a warm May afternoon, 17-year-old Esperanza, the once wobbly foal now grown into a graceful young horse, pranced nervously in the training corral, while Miguel, now 13, patiently guided her through the paces of a training exercise. His movements were confident and assured, his commands clear and consistent. After 3 years of daily lessons with George and the ranch hands, Miguel had developed into a skilled young horseman with a particular talent for working with the more spirited animals. From the fence, George Strait watched with undisguised pride as Miguel completed the exercise without a single misstep. The boy had grown several inches since his arrival at the ranch, his once skinny frame now solid with the healthy muscle of adolescence and regular physical work. His English had become nearly flawless, though he still spoke Portuguese at home with Rosana, who insisted he maintain his connection to his Brazilian heritage. "Perfect execution," George called out as Miguel brought Esperanza to a halt and patted her neck affectionately. "She's really responding to your cues now." Miguel beamed at the praise. "She's smart. Just needed someone to be patient with her." As the boy led the horse toward the stables for cooling down and grooming, George fell into step beside him. "Your mother called from the clinic. She'll be done with her shift around 5. Thought we might all have dinner together at the main house tonight. Norma's making that Brazilian fish stew you both like." "Moqueca." Miguel's face lit up. "That would be great. Mom loves when Mrs. Strait makes Brazilian food." The mention of Rosanna brought a satisfied smile to George's face. Her transformation over the past 3 years had been as remarkable as her son's. After successful cardiac surgery to repair a congenital defect that had gone untreated for decades, Rosanna's health had improved dramatically. With her legal status stabilized through the humanitarian parole program and now proceeding toward permanent residency, thanks to Robert Davidson's continued legal assistance, she had been able to obtain proper certification for her nursing skills. Now she worked part-time at a local community health clinic, using her bilingual abilities to help other immigrants navigate the often confusing American healthcare system. The work was personally fulfilling and allowed her to maintain a schedule that prioritized Miguel's school and activities. She mentioned that Dr. Patel offered her more hours starting next month, George commented, as they entered the cool dimness of the stables. Said she's becoming their most requested nurse for the Spanish-speaking patients. Miguel nodded proudly. "She's helping people like we needed help before. She says it makes the hard times worth something." The simple wisdom of this statement struck George anew. It was precisely this perspective, finding meaning in suffering by using it to help others, that had most impressed him about both Rosanna and Miguel from the beginning. Despite the hardships they had endured, neither had become bitter or entitled. Instead, they had embraced their second chance with gratitude and a determination to pay it forward. As Miguel expertly removed Esperanza's saddle and began the grooming process, George leaned against the stall door, contemplating how much his own life had changed since that fateful evening in Nashville. What had begun as a simple act of charity, feeding a hungry child, had evolved into something far more significant, a relationship that had enriched his and Norma's lives beyond measure. "Got something to show you later," George said casually, as Miguel worked a soft brush over Esperanza's gleaming coat. After dinner, Miguel glanced up curiously. "What kind of something?" "The kind you have to wait to find out about," George replied with a wink. "Patience, remember, like with the horses." The boy grinned, accustomed to George's occasional surprises and willing to wait. Over the years, he had learned that good things often came to those who approached life with patience and diligence, lessons reinforced both by George's mentorship and by his mother's example. Later that evening, as the extended family gathered around the dining table in the main house, the conversation flowed easily between English, Spanish, and the occasional Portuguese phrase that both George and Norma had picked up from their house guests turned family. Norma's moqueca de peixe was pronounced authentic by Rosanna, who had shared her family recipe and cooking techniques with her host over countless collaborative kitchen sessions. "Miguel got his history test back today," Rosanna announced proudly. "Tell them, filho." The boy blushed slightly, but couldn't hide his pleased expression. 98%. Mrs. Henderson said my essay on the Texas Revolution was the best in the class. "That's outstanding," George praised sincerely. "You've really found your voice in your writing. I still remember when you were worried about writing assignments because of the language barrier. You helped me a lot," Miguel said. "All those books you gave me and the way you and Mrs. Strait would listen to me read out loud even when I made mistakes." Norma reached over to squeeze his hand affectionately. "It was our pleasure. Besides, your English surpassed mine in Spanish very quickly. I'm still struggling with my conjugations. But your pronunciation is much improved." Rosanna assured her with a warm smile. "Much better than my English when I first came to America." As they finished the meal with a dessert of traditional Brazilian pudim de leite condensado that Rosanna had prepared, George exchanged a meaningful glance with Norma, who nodded slightly in encouragement. "Before we wrap up," George said, setting down his napkin, "I mentioned to Miguel earlier that I had something to show him. Actually, it's for both of you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope, which he slid across the table to Rosanna. "This came by certified mail today." Rosanna looked at the envelope with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Official mail still triggered an instinctive anxiety in her, a remnant of years spent fearing deportation. But the return address, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and George's encouraging expression eased her concern. With slightly trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and removed the formal letter inside. As she read, her hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately filling her eyes. "Mom, what is it?" Miguel asked worriedly, moving to her side. "Our permanent residency," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's approved. Both of us. We are legal residents now, green cards." Miguel stared at the letter in disbelief. Though he had understood the process intellectually, the temporary humanitarian parole, the application for adjustment of status, the interviews and paperwork that had consumed so much of the past 3 years, the emotional reality of what it meant hit him all at once. "We don't have to be afraid anymore?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable in a way it hadn't been for months. "No more fear," Rosanna confirmed, pulling him into a tight embrace. "We are home now, truly home." George cleared his throat, fighting his own surge of emotion at witnessing this milestone. "Robert said the cards themselves should arrive within 2 weeks, and in 5 years you'll be eligible to apply for citizenship if you choose to." "Citizenship," Rosanna repeated the word, as if testing how it felt in her mouth. "To be American citizen is dream I never thought possible." "Well, Robert deserves most of the credit," George said modestly. "He navigated all the legal complexities. We just provided supporting documentation." Norma gave her husband a gentle, chiding look. "George Strait, you stop that right now. You and I both know that without your testimony about Miguel's educational progress, Rosanna's community contributions, and the stability of their living situation, this might not have happened. Not to mention the medical documentation proving Rosanna needed to remain in the U.S. for proper cardiac care." George accepted his wife's correction with a sheepish smile. He had never been comfortable taking credit, always preferring to deflect attention from his charitable actions. It was one of the qualities that had endeared him to fans throughout his long career, his genuine humility, despite his extraordinary success. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a second envelope. "This one's more of a suggestion than a done deal. You should discuss it privately before giving us any answer." Rosanna accepted the second envelope with curiosity. Inside was a set of legal documents that, at first glance, appeared to be property, paperwork. As she studied them more closely, her confusion gave way to astonishment. "This is deed to guest house?" she asked, looking up at George and Norma with wide eyes. "Not exactly," George explained gently. "It's a proposal for an arrangement we'd like you to consider. Norma and I would transfer ownership of the guest house and the surrounding 5 acres to both of you, with certain conditions that would make it manageable financially." Miguel looked between the adults, trying to process what was happening. "You want to give us the house to own?" "We want to provide you with permanent security," Norma clarified. "You've made that house your home. You've put down roots here. Miguel's education, your job at the clinic, your friends in the community, all of that matters. We don't want you to ever have to worry about losing your home again." "The legal structure would be what they call a life estate," George continued. "Essentially, you would own the house and land with minimal property taxes due to agricultural exemptions. There would be a condition that if you ever decided to sell, we or our heirs would have first right to purchase it back at fair market value." Rosanna shook her head, overwhelmed. "Is too much. We can never repay such generosity." "We're not asking for repayment," George said firmly. "In fact, if you look at it from our perspective, we're being somewhat selfish." "Selfish?" Miguel questioned, confused by this characterization. George smiled. "Yes, selfish, because having you both here, seeing Miguel grow up and work with the horses, having Rosanna join Norma's garden club and bring new recipes to our table, it's enriched our lives immeasurably. When you reach our age, you realize that the greatest wealth isn't in bank accounts but in relationships, and the knowledge that you've made a positive difference somehow." Norma nodded in agreement. "After we lost Jennifer, a part of us shut down for a long time. Yes, we had George Jr. and eventually his children, but there was always that empty space that nothing could fill." Her voice softened. "Having you both here hasn't replaced Jennifer. Nothing ever could, but it's brought new purpose and joy into our lives." "You don't need to decide right now," George added. "Take the documents, review them with Robert if you'd like. Make sure you understand everything before giving us an answer." Rosanna carefully returned the papers to the envelope, her hands still shaking slightly. "We will think about it seriously, but know that whatever we decide about House, our gratitude, it is beyond words." "I know exactly how to show gratitude," Miguel declared suddenly, his young face animated with purpose. "I've been working on something. Can I get it now?" At George's curious nod, the boy dashed off to the guest house, returning minutes later, clutching a large flat package wrapped in simple brown paper. He presented it to George and Norma with a mixture of pride and nervousness. "For both of you, to say thank you for everything." As George carefully unwrapped the package, a beautifully framed oil painting was revealed. It showed the Strait ranch at sunset, with horses grazing in the foreground and the main house and guest house visible in the middle distance. The Texas sky was rendered in spectacular detail, the colors bleeding from orange to purple in a way that perfectly captured the distinctive quality of Texas sunsets. "Miguel," Norma breathed, astonished. "Did you paint this?" The boy nodded, shyly. "My art teacher, Mrs. Delaney, she helped me. I've been working on it for months in the art room after school. Do you like it?" George studied the painting with genuine admiration. The technique might show the hand of a young artist still, developing his skills, but the emotion and attention to detail were remarkable. The way the fading light caught on the limestone of the houses, the accurate rendering of the horses' forms, the sense of peace that pervaded the scene, all spoke of both talent and deep affection for the subject. "Like it?" "Son, I love it," George said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is going up in the living room where everyone can see it." Miguel beamed with pride. "I wanted to show how I see this place, how it looks to me now that it's home." That single word, home, resonated through the room, carrying with it the weight of all they had experienced together. For Miguel and Rosanna, it represented the end of a period of desperate insecurity and the beginning of a future filled with possibility. For George and Norma, it confirmed that their instinctive decision to help a hungry boy and his sick mother had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting. Later that night, after Miguel and Rosanna had returned to their house, soon perhaps to legally become their home, George stood on the porch of the main house, gazing up at the star-filled Texas sky. Norma joined him, slipping her hand into his as she had done countless times throughout their long marriage. "Penny for your thoughts," she said softly. George smiled. "I was thinking about chance or fate or whatever you want to call it. How if I hadn't decided to try that particular restaurant in Nashville that night, or if I'd been seated at a different table, or if Miguel had approached someone else first?" "But he didn't," Norma reminded him gently. "He approached you, and you listened. That's what matters." "It makes me wonder how many other Miguels and Rosannas are out there," George mused. "People with so much to offer, so much potential, who just need someone to see them as human beings worthy of a chance." Norma nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that's something we should think more about. Not just individual cases, though those matter tremendously, but systemic ways to create more opportunities." George considered this. Throughout his career, he had supported numerous charities, performed at countless benefit concerts, and lent his name to worthy causes. But the direct personal impact of helping Miguel and Rosanna had affected him more profoundly than any of those larger philanthropic efforts. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been thinking about setting up a scholarship program for kids like Miguel, immigrants or children of immigrants with academic promise and financial need. Not just money for college, but mentorship, connections, the kind of support that makes the difference between just getting by and truly thriving." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Norma agreed warmly. "We could work with the local schools initially, then maybe expand it over time." As they continued discussing the possibilities, a movement caught George's eye. In the distance, a light had come on in the guest house, now potentially Miguel and Rosanna's permanent home. He could just make out two figures on its small porch, mother and son, apparently engaged in their own conversation beneath the same starry sky. The sight brought a sense of completion, of things coming full circle. What had begun with a simple act of kindness, buying a meal for a hungry child, had evolved into a relationship that had changed all their lives immeasurably for the better. In his long, storied career, George Strait had achieved more than most artists could dream of. Multiple Grammy Awards, countless #1 hits, induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame, and the enduring admiration of millions of fans worldwide. But in this moment, watching that small light in the distance, he felt a different kind of satisfaction, the quiet joy of knowing that sometimes the most meaningful achievements aren't the ones that earn public recognition, but those that transform individual lives. "You're smiling," Norma observed, squeezing his hand. "I was just thinking," George replied, "about the strange and wonderful ways that life works out sometimes. How the things that seem like coincidences or small decisions can end up being the most important ones we ever make." As they turned to go inside, George took one last look at the distant light of the guest house, a beacon of hope and new beginnings in the vast Texas night. Whatever the future held for Miguel and Rosanna, for himself and Norma, they would face it together, bound by something stronger than legal documents or financial arrangements, the enduring connection of human hearts that had recognized in each other not just need and capacity to help, but the shared dignity that makes us all part of the same human family. And in that recognition lay the most powerful legacy of all, not fame or fortune, but the knowledge that through one simple act of kindness, worlds had been changed forever.